May 13, 1940, the Sedan sector, French border. Dawn bleeds light over the Meuse River. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth. And diesel, for days, the thunder of a distant approach has echoed through the Ardennes forest, a sound dismissed by French high command as impossible for a modern army to traverse, but now the impossible is here. Stuka dive bombers, Junkers Ju-87s, peel from the sky. Their screaming sirens are not just a weapon of destruction, but of psychological terror. They fall like falcons, releasing their payloads with unnerving precision on the French bunker lines. The world dissolves into concussive blasts and geysers of soil and concrete. Before the dust settles, rubber assault boats, packed with young combat engineer pioneer, push into the current. They are paddling not just across a river, but into the heart of a military doctrine the world has never seen. On the far bank, German infantry scramble up the slopes, silencing stunned French strongpoints with grenades and machine pistol fire. This is not the methodical, artillery-saturated siege of the Great War. This is something new, something fast, something terrifying. The Blitzkrieg has reached the Meuse, and in hours it will shatter the French army's spine. The world is about to witness a revolution in warfare. The shockwave from this single crossing will ripple across continents, eventually reaching the quiet, sprawling factories of a nation not yet at war, triggering a response of a scale and fury that the architects of this new terror could never comprehend. The storm that broke over the Meuse in the spring of 1940 was not a spontaneous event. It was the culmination of 2 decades of German military introspection, technological innovation, and seething political resentment. The seeds of Blitzkrieg were sown in the mud of the Western Front. German strategists like Hans von Seeckt, head of the post-war Reichswehr, meticulously studied the stalemate of trench warfare. He concluded that the future lay not in attrition, but in speed, mobility, and decisive maneuver. The goal was to avoid the enemy's strength entirely, to strike at command and logistics, the brain and nervous system, rather than bludgeoning the body. This doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, required new tools and a new kind of soldier. The Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany tanks and an air force, so development went underground and theoretical. Officers like Heinz Guderian, passionate advocate of armored warfare, studied the works of British theorists J.F.C. Fuller and B.H. Liddell Hart. Guderian envisioned panzer divisions not as infantry support but as independent, combined-arm spearheads. They would be the scalpel that made the deep surgical cut. The enabling technologies emerged in parallel. The reliable, high-frequency radio, which allowed tank commanders to coordinate in real time, and the versatile medium bomber, the Junkers Ju-88, which could serve as both level and dive bomber. Politically, the stage was set by Adolf Hitler's rise. He saw in these new military concepts the perfect instrument for his ambitions of conquest and Lebensraum, living space. He championed Guderian's ideas, overriding the skepticism of more traditional generals. The Wehrmacht, reborn in 1935, was rapidly expanded and equipped. The Panzer I and II were light training tanks, but they were a start. The Luftwaffe was built from scratch by Hermann Göring into a potent tactical air force, designed not for strategic bombing, but to win air superiority over the battlefield and directly support the army. The 1936-39 Spanish Civil War became a testing ground. The Condor Legion perfected the terror bombing of cities at Guernica, while German observers noted the vulnerabilities of slower, less coordinated Republican forces. By 1939, Germany had forged a weapon of unparalleled sharpness. It was a military culture that prized initiative at the lowest levels, the Auftragstaktik or mission type command, where junior officers understood the intent and were free to achieve it as they saw fit. This stood in stark contrast to the rigid, top-down command structures. Its future foes, the stage was set for a demonstration. The first act would be in Poland. The swift victory over Poland in September 1939, while stunning the world, was seen by many German generals as a risky prelude. the real test, they knew, lay in the West. Against the armies of France and Britain, the very powers that had brought the Kaisers. Germany to its knees 2 decades prior. The victory in Poland was decisive, but the Wehrmacht's high command, the OKW, was apprehensive. They faced the French army, reputed to be the strongest in the world. Protected by the mighty Maginot Line, a vast, sophisticated network of underground forts and artillery emplacements along the German border, the initial plan, Gelb Case Yellow, was a conservative rehash of the 1914 Schlieffen Plan, a thrust. Through Belgium, it promised a brutal head-on collision, but then a more audacious alternative emerged, championed by General Erich von Manstein. The Manstein Plan, or Sichelschnitt sickle cut, was a masterpiece of operational deception. It proposed a feint in the north, drawing the best Allied mobile units, French armored divisions and the British Expeditionary Force, into Belgium. Meanwhile, the main German assault, the Schwerpunkt point of main effort, would crash through the impassable Ardennes forest. This was the key psychological stroke. The French high command, steeped in the defensive mentality of World War I, considered the Ardennes a natural tank barrier. They left it thinly guarded by second-rate, static divisions. On May 10, 1940, the trap was sprung. Army Group B invaded the Netherlands and Belgium, paratroopers seizing key bridges and forts in daring airborne operations. As planned, the Allied mobile forces surged north to meet the threat. Simultaneously, Army Group A, a vast armored fist of 7 panzer divisions, began its slow, chaotic, but ultimately undetected movement through the Ardennes. For 3 days, the forest swallowed the columns. Tanks, trucks, and horse-drawn supply wagons created a 250-kilometer traffic jam. A vulnerable target had Allied air power located it, but the Allies were looking the wrong way. On May 13 at Sedan, the Panzers reached the Meuse. The Luftwaffe delivered a crushing, hours-long aerial bombardment that shattered the French defenders. German assault crossings began. By the next day, bridgeheads were secured and engineer teams were frantically building pontoon bridges. As the first panzers rolled across, the breach was made. The campaign was only 4 days old, but the strategic outcome was already decided. The German spearheads now turned west, not east, racing for the English Channel to cut off the entire Allied left wing. The world watched in stunned disbelief as the seemingly invincible French army crumbled in weeks. The Blitzkrieg was not just a new tactic, it was a psychological earthquake that shattered old certainties about war. The success of this new form of warfare created an aura of invincibility around the Wehrmacht, an aura that would only deepen with the lightning conquest of Yugoslavia and Greece and the early, devastating successes against the Soviet Union. It seemed a force that could not be stopped by traditional military means, but the very speed of these victories was creating a strategic dilemma, stretching German resources to a breaking point and awakening a sleeping industrial giant across the Atlantic. For the men of the Vorratsabteilung, the advanced detachment, the Blitzkrieg was a surreal, exhausting, and intoxicating experience. They were not the faceless horde of propaganda, but highly trained specialists, riding the crest of the war's most advanced wave. A young panzer commander, his head and shoulders exposed in the cupola of a Panzer III, existed in a world of sensory overload. The constant roar of the engine, the smell of oil in cordite, the metallic clang of the hull, and the relentless flow of information through his headset. His world was a narrow slice of landscape framed by his binoculars, his mission to push forward, always forward. These spearhead units operated on a knife's edge, often far ahead of their own infantry and supply lines. They lived on captured fuel and adrenaline. Initiative was everything. Young lieutenant encountering an unexpected roadblock or a bridge prepared for demolition had to assess, attack, and overcome in minutes. There was no time to request orders from a distant headquarters. This was Auftragstaktik in its purest form. The chaos was a weapon they wielded better than their enemies. They moved with it. speed that preempted enemy reactions, creating a fog of war so thick that Allied command structures collapsed under its weight. The human cost, however, was etched into the faces of these men: the constant fatigue, the loss of comrades to a lucky anti-tank gun or a determined pocket of resistance, the gnawing anxiety of being cut off. They were the embodiment of the Blitzkrieg's terrifying efficiency, but they were also its most vulnerable component, advancing on a logistical thread that grew thinner with every kilometer gained. This relentless pace set by the men in the lead created a vacuum behind them, a vacuum that the high command struggled to fill with the men and material needed to consolidate their stunning gains. In the chateaus and command bunkers of the Allied High Command, the Blitzkrieg did not initially register as a new form of warfare. It was interpreted as a series of local breakthroughs, problems to be contained with textbook counterattacks. The French Commander-in-Chief, General Maurice Gamelin, and his British counterparts were prisoners of a previous war. Their mental map of conflict was drawn in the indelible ink of 1918, methodical artillery barrages, phased infantry advances, and continuous fortified lines. The phone lines to the front crackled with reports that made no sense. According to their doctrine, the speed of the German advance created a crippling informational paralysis. By the time a situation report reached headquarters, it was hours out of date. The Panzers were already 50 kilometers further on. Rumors of German units here, there, and everywhere created a climate of panic and indecision. The French had more and often better tanks than the Germans, like the formidable Char B-1 bis, but they were dispersed in penny packets for infantry support or held in reserve for a decisive battle that never materialized in the form they expected. When they were committed, it was too late. Piecemeal and without adequate air cover, the psychological impact was devastating. The very foundation of their military understanding crumbled. The Maginot Line, a monument to defensive thinking, was rendered irrelevant overnight. The German sickle cut through the Ardennes was not just a physical maneuver, it was a cognitive blow that shattered the Allied command's will. The collapse was not merely one of armies, but of a whole philosophy of war. The stunning surrender of France in June 1940 left Britain standing alone, and its prime Minister Winston Churchill staring across the Atlantic, knowing that salvation, if it were to come, would require a different kind of power, not just tactical brilliance, but the raw, unrelenting power of production. While Europe burned, America was at peace, its vast industrial capacity idling in the throes of the Great Depression. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the threat. In a December 1940 fireside chat, he articulated a new vision for the nation's role. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." This was not a call to arms, but a call to factories. The task was Herculean: to convert the world's largest peacetime economy into a war machine capable of outfitting not only its own future army, but also those its allies through the Lend-Lease program. The men who answered this call were industrialists like William S. Knudsen, the former president of General Motors, who was recruited to head the Office of Production Management. Knudsen's genius was not in invention, but in organization and scale. He applied the principles of American mass production, standardization, specialization, and the moving assembly line to the art of war. Factories that once built cars were retooled to build tanks. A refrigerator plant began producing machine guns. The Willow Run bomber plant, built by Ford, became an emblem of this effort, a mile-long assembly line where B-24 Liberator bombers rolled out at a rate of 1 per hour. This was warfare reimagined as a logistical equation. The goal was not to build the perfect tank, but to build thousands of good enough tanks. The M4 Sherman tank, which would become the workhorse of the Allied armies, was designed for reliability, ease of manufacture, and rapid repair. It was a stark contrast to the German approach, which favored complex, hand-finished masterpieces like the later Tiger and Panther tanks which were magnificent but could never be built in sufficient numbers. The American industrialist waged war with slide rules and production quotas, understanding that the battle was won not just on the front lines, but on the factory floor, in the shipyards and on the railway lines. Their weapon was volume, a tide of steel that would eventually wash over the battlefields of Europe. This philosophy of volume over virtuosity would define the tools that American soldiers would wield, setting the stage for a brutal confrontation between quality and quantity. On the battlefield, the clash between the Wehrmacht and the U.S. industrial juggernaut was physically embodied in the tanks that fought the war. The trajectory of German armored vehicle design was one of escalating quality and complexity, driven by the shock of encountering superior Soviet T-34s in 1941, the Panzer III and IV, the workhorses of 1940, were obsolete by 1943. In response, Germany fielded the Panther, a medium tank, with the firepower and armor of a heavy tank, and the Tiger I, a fearsome heavy tank, whose 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at long range. These machines were marvels of engineering. The Tiger's interleaved road wheels provided a smooth ride, and its thick, sloped armor was nearly impervious to frontal attack, but they were also over-engineered. They consumed vast amounts of scarce raw materials, required highly skilled labor for thousands of man-hours to build, and were notoriously prone to mechanical breakdown. A Tiger was a strategic asset, often immobilized by a failed final drive or a lack of fuel. They were kings of the battlefield. But there were never enough of them. The American M4 Sherman was their antithesis. It was designed for mass production. From the outset, its gasoline engine was less efficient than a diesel but more readily available. Its armor was adequate, its 75mm gun sufficient for most targets in 1942-43. Most importantly, it was reliable, easy to transport, and simple to maintain. By 1944, over 40,000 Shermans had been built, compared to around 1,300 Tigers. The American philosophy was clear. One Sherman might lose to a Tiger, but 5 Shermans with their mechanical reliability and numerical advantage would win. They could afford the losses. The Germans could not. This technological divergence reflected the core strategic difference. Germany fought a tactician's war, seeking a decisive battle. America was preparing for a strategist's war, a war of attrition where the last tank standing would win. The ultimate test of these competing philosophies, the qualitative excellence of the German spearhead versus the quantitative might of the American tide, would not occur in the open plains of Poland or France, but in the brutal, close-quarters killing fields of Normandy's Bocage country. The turning point was not a single battle, but a slow, grinding pivot that occurred over 2 years and 2 fronts. It began in the vastness of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was the ultimate expression of Blitzkrieg, a massive, multi-pronged invasion designed to crush the USSR in a single campaign. Initially, it succeeded beyond German expectations. Millions of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured, but the Blitzkrieg model, optimized for the confined spaces of Western Europe, began to falter in the Russian expanse. The Schwerpunkt advanced, but the distances became too great, the supply lines impossibly long. The Soviet army, though mauled, did not disintegrate. It retreated, traded space for time, and learned. The Battle of Moscow in late 1941 was the first time the Blitzkrieg was halted. Then came the titanic struggle for Stalingrad in 1942-43, which devoured an entire German army. The Eastern Front became a voracious consumer of German men and material, meat grinder that bled the Wehrmacht of its finest troops and its strategic reserve. Simultaneously, on December 11, 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States. Catastrophic strategic blunder that unified America's European and Pacific conflicts and unleashed the full, untapped potential of its industrial might against him. While the Wehrmacht was locked in a death struggle in the East, the United States began its own form of blitzkrieg, an industrial one. Shipyards like Kaiser's in Richmond churned out Liberty ships in a matter of days. Automotive plants became tank arsenals. The first waves of this American production, in the form of M3 Lee tanks and P-40 Warhawk fighters, began to reinforce the British in North Africa. The Battle of El Alamein. In late 1942, a brutal battle of attrition fought with vast amounts of British and American equipment showed that the Axis could be beaten in a straight fight. The tide was turning, but the final, definitive confrontation between the old blitzkrieg and the new industrial war machine was being prepared on the shores of England. The plan was called Operation Overlord. The invasion of Normandy was the anvil upon which the German war machine would be broken, but it was the simultaneous, relentless pressure from the Soviet summer offensive Operation Bagration that acted as the hammer, ensuring the Wehrmacht could not concentrate its forces to throw the Allies back into the sea. D-Day was the antithesis of blitzkrieg. It was a massive, set-piece invasion, the product of 2 years of meticulous planning and staggering logistical accumulation. It was the arsenal of democracy coming ashore. The beaches were not taken by speed and surprise alone, but by overwhelming firepower and the sheer mass of men and material. For weeks after the landings, the campaign bogged down in the nightmarish bocage. Ancient hedgerows that turned the countryside into a labyrinth of death, perfect for German defense. This was the environment where the technological and doctrinal clash became most acute. A single well-hidden Panther or Tiger tank, commanded by a veteran of the Eastern Front, could decimate an entire American tank platoon. The Sherman's 75 gun would often simply bounce off the frontal armor of these German beasts. American tank crews paid a bloody price, nicknaming their Shermans Ronsons for their tendency to catch fire. For a moment, it seemed the qualitative superiority of German weaponry might still prevail. But the American system adapted with breathtaking speed. Field workshops welded improvised steel hedgerow cutters onto Shermans to punch through the bocage. More crucially, the industrial Juggernaut responded to the tank crisis not by redesigning the Sherman but by upgunning it. A new version with a high-velocity 76mm gun was rushed to the front. Even more effective were the M10 and M36 tank destroyers, mobile platforms for powerful anti-tank guns, and overhead, the Allies possessed total air superiority. The skies swarmed with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, acting as flying artillery that could smash any German concentration daring enough to move in daylight. The climax came with Operation Cobra in late July 1944, after a devastating carpet bombing by thousands of Allied aircraft that pulverized a narrow section of the German front. The American First Army, now equipped with a mix of improved Shermans and specialized armor, burst through the cracked German lines. This was not the delicate maneuver of 1940. This was a sledgehammer blow, led by generals like George Patton. The revitalized American armored divisions now executed their own version of blitzkrieg, but with an inexhaustible supply of fuel, ammunition, and replacements flowing from the Normandy beaches. The breakout from Normandy was the moment the U.S. industrial Juggernaut achieved full, unstoppable momentum on the battlefield. The German response, a desperate last-gasp blitzkrieg in the Ardennes in December 1944, would serve as the final, brutal proof that their way of war had been rendered obsolete by the sheer weight of American production. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final offensive in the West, was a macabre echo of 1940. Launched through the same Ardennes sector in December 1944, it initially achieved surprise, creating a bulge in the Allied lines, but this was not the Wehrmacht of 1940. Its infantry was filled with green conscripts, and its panzer divisions, though equipped with King Tigers and other advanced armor, were starved of fuel and air cover. They advanced until they ran out of gasoline, becoming sitting ducks for the now ubiquitous Allied fighter bombers. The American response after the initial shock was a testament to its new military industrial system. Isolated units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne held critical road junctions, refusing demands to surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," became a symbol of American resilience, but their defiance was enabled by the system behind them. The clear weather that finally arrived allowed the full might of the Allied air forces to decimate the German columns. Fresh American divisions were rushed to the front. Sherman tanks, now in overwhelming numbers, engaged the scarce German behemoths from all sides. The German offensive was halted, then crushed. The Wehrmacht had expended its last strategic reserve in the west for no gain. The path into the heart of Germany was now open. The final months of the war were a relentless, brutal demonstration of industrial age warfare. American and British armies advanced on broad fronts, methodically, overwhelming the crippled German defenses. The statistics tell the story of the Juggernaut's victory. The United States produced 88,410 tanks during the war. Germany produced 44,550, many of which were overly complex and unreliable. The U.S. built 324,750 aircraft. Germany built 189,307. In artillery pieces, the disparity was even greater, 257,390 for the U.S. versus 73,484 for Germany. This was not a war won by superior tactics alone. It was won by the ability to replace every lost Sherman with two more. While the German Panzer divisions slowly bled to death, their magnificent tanks abandoned for lack of fuel or spare parts. The Ruhr was encircled in April 1945, strangling what remained of German industry. The final act was the meeting of American and Soviet soldiers at the Elbe River, a symbolic handshake over the corpse of the Third Reich. The physical and human cost was staggering. German cities were reduced to rubble. Its military lay shattered, with over 5 million dead. The Blitzkrieg, once the terror of Europe, had been systematically dismantled and ground into dust by a force whose scale it could never match. The aftermath of this colossal struggle reshaped the world. The United States emerged not just victorious, but as a global superpower, its economy strengthened by the war, and its homeland untouched by battle. The arsenal of democracy had proven that in modern total war, the capacity for sustained production was the ultimate strategic weapon. The Marshall Plan, which poured billions of American dollars into rebuilding it, shattered Europe, was a continuation of this philosophy, using economic power to secure peace and create new markets, a stark contrast to the punitive reparations after World War I. For the defeated Wehrmacht, the legacy was one of tragic irony. Its operational brilliance and tactical genius are still studied in military academies today. The concept of Blitzkrieg and Auftragstaktik became foundational to modern armies, including the U.S. Army's own airland battle doctrine. Yet these strengths were fatally undermined by flawed strategy, a chaotic, ideologically driven command structure, and a fundamental inability to match the industrial output of its adversaries. They won nearly every battle until late 1942, but lost the war irrevocably. The psychological impact was profound. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht would persist for decades, a narrative that separated the professional soldier from the crimes of the Nazi regime. But historical research has since eroded this myth, revealing the deep complicity of the German army in the horrors of the Holocaust and the brutal war of annihilation in the East. The Blitzkrieg, for all its sleek efficiency, had been the vehicle for an unspeakable barbarism. The American industrial juggernaut, for its part, had learned a sobering lesson, that technological and quantitative superiority, while decisive, came at a terrible human cost, a cost borne by the young soldiers who had to close with and destroy a formidable enemy in the fields and forests of Europe. The world was left with a new, terrifying understanding of modern conflict, a trinity of industrial capacity, scientific innovation, and the enduring will of the citizen soldier would determine the fate of nations. This hard-won understanding would frame every geopolitical and military decision. The new post-war world, a world living in the shadow of the industrial and destructive power that had been unleashed. The clash between the Wehrmacht's Blitzkrieg and the American industrial Juggernaut was more than a military contest. It was a philosophical collision between two visions of power. One was the power of the perfect strike, a focused, brilliant, and devastating application of force designed to win quickly by inducing systemic shock. The other was the power of the enduring tide, a broad, relentless, and overwhelming application of mass designed to win inevitably by imposing exhaustion. The story of the Second World War in the West is the story of the strike faltering and the tide rising to engulf it. In the end, the Blitzkrieg was a masterpiece of tactics without a sustainable strategy. It was a rapier, lethal in a duel but useless against a tsunami. The American response demonstrated that in the industrial age, the ability to produce, transport, and replace became the highest forms of military art. The true victor was not merely the general or the soldier, but the factory worker, the welder, the engineer, and the logistician. They built not just tanks and planes, but a new kind of warfare where resilience and volume trumped speed and finesse. The echoes of this confrontation still resonate, a permanent lesson etched in steel and history, that no matter how sharp the spear, it is ultimately no match for the forge that made it.